Okay, if we look at Ultramarker, we've got this assessment here. This is the rubric on which it's based. So we've got a report with an introduction, discussion and recommendations with various weightings. And when we look at that in Ultramarker, we see that we've got a report with introduction, discussion and recommendations. Now the thing is, suppose that represents a report for, say one item, but supposing we wanted our students to report on, say, a number of different laboratories, for example, or perhaps for different topics. So how could we use that? So in other words, we want them to provide us with an introduction, discussion and recommendations for each of the laboratory sessions or each of the topics. So how can we do that? There is one technique that we can use, which is experimental in Ultramarker. If we go to settings and we select session, multiple sessions, and you'll see that we get a session tab appear. Also at the bottom we get some buttons that appear relating to sessions as well. So if we go into sessions, I've just loaded a file which I've set up here, so I can load the session. I've called it Tech Session SSN, and I've created a number of sessions. I've said add session. I've created 4 lab sessions, lab 1, 2, 3 and 4, and I've given them weighting. Each of those has got a weighting of 25%, so you can see if I edit the session, to each of those is 25%, which adds up to 100%. So now I can work with this assessment criteria to mark a number of different labs, and I can move between those sessions. So I'm on lab 2, lab 3, lab 4, and I can move back to lab 1 again. I might want to check my weights. Now my introduction has got a weighting of 10%, discussion is to 70, recommendations is 20. That should add up to 100, but of course with my various sessions they also need to add up to 100% as well. So I'll check weights, and it says that the session criteria is okay, and the total session weights are 100% as well, and we've got 4 sessions for this assessment. Now I'm ready to start marking my students. So I'll go into marking mode, and I'll enter a student name and I'll start marking. And so I start by looking at the lab 1. Look at the introduction, I'll give the student a mark, do the same thing for the discussion, same thing for recommendations, and I might want to put some comments in there as well, so I can, just like any other assessment, I can add comments. I can add comments for the overall assessment too. I won't do that on this occasion. I'll move to lab 2. I'll also assess that work as well, so I'm giving them marks based upon the work they've done. Go to lab 3, same thing again, and then I'll move to lab 4, and I'm doing the same thing again, giving them a mark for each of the criteria. So you need to make sure that you've given them a mark for each of the criteria for each of the lab sessions, so you might want to go back and just double check that. Then we're ready to save that work. So once we've saved that, we get an overall percentage. When we go into the report, you can see that the contents of the report show the split for each lab session. So each session is shown here, and the mark and feedback for each session and the overall grade are also shown. And I can save that for this student. So that's one method that I can use, is to use multiple sessions. I will clear the marks for this student, go back to edit criteria mode, and I'm going to switch sessions off. So I'm going to remove sessions, so no sessions or single session. And it's going to reset the number of sessions to 0. I will now load an assessment that I've started work on. And what I've done here is I've added 3 criteria, which are lab 1, lab 2, lab 3, and within each of those criteria I've added subcriteria. I'll show you how I've done that, because I'm going to add lab 4. So lab 4 appears as a criteria, and I'm going to add a subcriteria and call this introduction. Add another subcriteria, call it discussion. And then finally we'll add the recommendations. So we've got the recommendations. Now what I've done is I've weighted each of my labs at 25%, so I need to do the same thing with this one. So I'm going to edit the criteria, make this 25%. Now the other thing is that within each of my criteria I've weighted the subcriteria according to my rubric. So I've said the introduction is 10%, discussion 70, recommendations are 20. So I'm going to do the same thing. I've made my introduction 10%, discussion 70, recommendations 20. So I'll do the same thing with the subcriteria here. So introduction is 10%, discussion is 70, and then my recommendations are 20. So I can check the weights again for the assessment, and it says that the criteria weights are okay at 100%, and I've selected no session or single session. The weightings are okay. Now the other thing to mention is if we go to settings and look at criteria type, I've selected no checkboxes. The weightings for the subcriteria are part of the weightings for the criteria, and that's what we've got. So each of our labs is weighted at 25%, but within those labs the subcriteria all add up to 100%. So introduction, discussion and recommendations add up to 100%. That's 100% of 25%, and that's the same for each of these subcriteria. So it's important to make sure you select the right criteria type when doing this. So I'm ready to start marking almost. Now you'll see that what I've got here is I've got my full description of the criteria requirements for lab 1 for this introduction, discussion and recommendations. I've also got my criteria to achieve each grade for every single grade. Now that's obviously, I haven't done that for lab 2, 3 or 4, but obviously that's something I would need to do, and that would potentially take a lot of work. If you've got 10 labs, that would take a lot of work to add all of those, but there's a way that we can simplify that. I will just save my assessment just temporarily. Just interim, just in case we lose anything. And I'll go to introduction. Now what I can do, if I right click on the subcriteria introduction, I can replicate the description. Now the description is this part here. I'm going to go to introduction, replicate that description here, do that for lab 2, lab 3 and also lab 4. And I'll do the same thing for the discussion. So replicate description. And then recommendations, same thing again. Replicate description. Now then I can also do the same thing for my criteria to achieve each grade. Now that would represent a lot of work otherwise, but I can simplify that. I'll cancel that. I will say replicate criteria, and then asks me, when I go to introduction for lab 2, it says replicate comments for this grade to selected criteria. Yes. Do this for all grades. Yes. And we'll do the same thing for lab 3 and lab 4. We'll go back to discussion again, cancel that, right click again, replicate criteria, go back to discussion again, discussion again, discussion again. Then we go back to recommendations, replicate criteria, same thing again, and then we just cancel that. So you can see if I go to lab 3 for example, you can see that we've got a description of the criteria requirements for introduction, discussion and recommendations, and we've also got the criteria to achieve each grade as well for each of my criterion there, my sub-criteria. So that simplifies the process. It almost you don't actually really need sessions to assess something like multiple laboratory work if you make use of these simplified, simple methods of replicating between criteria. So you can set up one criteria and sub-criteria and then replicate it. And I can also replicate things like learning outcomes and also the feedback. So this is optional feedback comments. I haven't got any here, but if I put some into lab 1, I could also replicate those to labs 2, 3 and 4. And I can have as many labs as I want to. I can have a number of other labs as well. So I will just save that assessment again. Just make sure you save it for next time. Then I'm ready to assess my student. So I'm going to go over to marking mode. Start marking my student. We'll just call them test 1A. And obviously for lab 1, what am I going to give them in a way of an introduction? So, and I go to lab 2, similar sort of thing that we did before. We go to lab 3, again assess them. And we go to lab 4. The other thing of course I can do for each of my criterion is I can add comments, the same that I did before for any other assessment, and I can add comments for the overall assessment as well. And once I'm happy with all of my we need to make sure that we've assessed all of the criterion in each of the labs. I'm ready then to save the student's mark. So I'll save that. And we get an overall assessment, and we can then report on that. And this time it will give you the criteria we call the criteria lab 1, and the sub-criterion will be introduction, discussion and recommendations. Criteria will be lab 2, then we've got criteria lab 3 and criteria lab 4, and eventually we've got our overall grade as well. So that's how we can do the same sort of thing, either using sessions or we can use criteria and sub-criteria. I would use the criteria and sub-criteria. That works best for me. Okay, as you can see, it's very easy to actually replicate. You can have maybe a dozen lab sessions or more using either method.